So today I want to talk a little bit about developing research questions. One of the first things I like to cover is just a basic overview. What is a research question? It's a question about your chosen topic that you hope to answer through conducting your research. The thesis is going to be your answer to the research question or questions. When you are writing a research question, it's a really good idea to put the chosen topic, that phrasal topic you came up with, in the question, because that really brings it together. How do I write a research question? It's a couple steps that you can take to write a research question. Think about your rhetorical purpose. Make sure your question isn't either too broad or too narrow, the same way you did with a phrase that you used for your topic, the same way you went through that process of revising your topic. You're going to want to do the same thing with your research questions. And then the last step is to check to see if you need to revise your questions. So the first step is identify your rhetorical purpose. And this is really important because you are looking for different types of questions depending on the type of writing you're doing. So if you're writing a report or an informative piece of writing, your questions should be specific and answerable. And you're actually probably going to have multiple questions because in an informative piece of writing, you're trying to give a lot of the information. Many times when you're going to write an informative piece of writing, a single question isn't going to be enough to cover the topic or to really make a long enough paper. When you're doing something like a report or an informative piece of writing, you're probably going to want to have 3 or 4 questions that you're trying to answer about the topic. And in this case, they're going to be specific and answerable. If, however, you're writing a persuasive or reflective piece, your questions are going to be open-ended and debatable. There's not going to be a clear answer because the purpose of what you're doing is trying to find the answer in a complicated, complex, and open question. So the type of question you ask is going to be different depending on the type of writing you're trying to do. So some examples, if you were to write an informative piece of writing about Crohn's disease, a question you might have is, what are the symptoms of Crohn's disease? If you were going to do maybe a report or a survey about social media as a news source, you might want to ask the question, what do most young people think of social media as a news source? And then you would go out and you would look for sources to answer these specific questions. You might find a survey of young people and what they say so that you can actually find some sort of answer to put into your informative paper. If you look at the examples for a persuasive or reflective piece of writing, something like what is the most effective teaching method for autistic students, people are going to have different opinions on what that might look like. For a reflective piece, what lessons did I take away from my experience as a camp counselor? That's going to be, again, a really subjective, personal answer. There's not going to be like, oh, you did that wrong. It's an open question. So the types of questions you ask are going to differ depending on the type of writing you're doing. Step 2, make sure your question isn't too broad or too narrow. So something that's too broad, what are the impacts of mental illness? Whoa, that is so big. There are entire books written about that. There are entire books written about just a single mental illness, let alone the impacts of all mental illness. It's too broad. To narrow down, you can always ask the reporter's 5W questions, that who, why, what, when, where. You don't want to go overboard. So an example of something that's too narrow might be, what are the impacts of bipolar 1 disorder on 12-year-old girls in Newcastle County, Delaware? That might be a bit specific. You're going to have a hard time finding research that answers that question because it is so narrowed down. So don't go crazy when you're trying to do the, don't go overboard when you're trying to narrow it down. Just think about what elements might help you do a better job researching. And one that I think that you should try and answer, if not actually in your question, at least in your mind, so that you have a clear idea of it, is where. A lot of times people will throw out something, they might say like, okay, well, I'm going to look into the effects of texting on driving. And they want to write an informative piece about that. And so their question is, what are the impacts of texting while driving? And they ask that question. If you don't have a clear idea that your audience is based in the United States already in your head, you might not notice how it seems strange that when you write your final report, all of your sources come from Australia. I don't know why, but for some reason they do a lot of studies about this in Australia. I've actually had students do this before. And it just seems a little bit strange when you are thinking of your audience as primarily American. You're maybe using an ethos appeal in the beginning of your paper, or even a pathos appeal in the beginning of your paper, appealing to an American audience. And then all of your statistics and all of your research is based in Australia. It's a little bit strange. It's also really helpful to have this in your mind because it can help you from getting caught up in a disconnect of where maybe you're talking about the legal impacts of a certain type of behavior in nursing. If you want to talk about that, but your sources are based in the UK, you can see how there's going to be a disconnect because they have a different legal system than we do. If you don't clearly articulate, okay, my audience is going to be American, I'm mostly talking to people in the United States. If you don't have a clear idea of who that audience is and where they are, it can sometimes make your research not fit exactly with your purpose. So even if you don't add in the phrase in the United States, think about identifying that in general when you strike out to write your paper, because it will help you stay on the right path. Step 3, check to see if you need to revise. And this is something you can do even after you've written your questions. Once you have your questions, don't be afraid to come back and revise as needed and as you learn more. So if you realize that your questions are maybe too narrow, open your questions up. If you realize they're too broad, feel free to narrow them down. Some of this you may not learn until you actually start researching. So you can tweak as needed as you go to get the right kind of information for your paper. So that's a little bit about developing research questions.